There's a version of the Second World War that most people know. A story of moral clarity, of a great democratic alliance rising to defeat the most destructive ideology the modern world had produced. Britain stands alone. America answers the call. Together, they win. The arc of the story bends toward justice, toward liberation, toward the dawning of a better world order. It is a true story, as far as it goes. What that story leaves out is the bill, not the human cost, which was catastrophic, and which has been remembered with appropriate solemnity. The financial bill. The ledger that was being filled in, quietly and relentlessly, throughout every year of the conflict, in offices far from the front lines, by men in suits whose primary concern was not defeating Hitler, but extracting maximum value from the moment Britain needed America most. By the time that bill came due, it had not merely bankrupted the British Treasury, it had transferred the architecture of global power from London to Washington, not through conquest, but through contract. The United States did not defeat the British Empire, it bought it. And the sale was managed by the American Treasury as a distressed asset acquisition. To understand the transaction, you need to understand the state Britain was in by the winter of 1940. France had fallen. The beaches of Dunkirk had produced a military miracle that was also a catastrophic defeat. The threat of invasion was real and immediate. And the British Treasury, which had been the banker of the world for 3 centuries, was bleeding to death financially while its armies stood on the cliffs of Dover and waited for what came next. In December 1940, Winston Churchill wrote a letter to Franklin Roosevelt that was, underneath its carefully crafted language, an admission of insolvency. The country that had once been owed money by almost every other nation on earth was informing the leader of the one country that could save it that the money had run out. Britain had been paying cash for American supplies, the cash and carry policy that the neutrality legislation required. It had been paying with gold, with dollar reserves, with the proceeds of selling its overseas investments, and it had nearly reached the bottom. Roosevelt received this letter and understood its implications immediately. He also understood the political constraints he was operating under. The United States was constitutionally neutral. A large and vocal portion of the American public had no interest in entering another European war. Any arrangement that helped Britain had to be constructed carefully, presented to the American public as something other than what it was, and designed to serve American interests as clearly as it served British ones. The political performance and the economic reality of what followed were two very different things. Before Lend-Lease was even passed, Britain was being systematically stripped of its remaining assets through a policy that was dressed in the language of financial prudence and called internally the gold on the barrelhead requirement. Every purchase of American goods had to be paid for immediately and in full. No credit, no deferred payment. Cash, or its equivalent, transferred before the goods left American soil. The mechanics of meeting this requirement produced one of the most extraordinary logistical operations of the war, known as Operation Fish. Britain's remaining gold reserves, the accumulated wealth of centuries of imperial trade and financial dominance, were loaded onto warships and transported across the North Atlantic to Canada, where they were deposited with the Canadian government and drawn on to pay American suppliers. The value of gold transferred in this operation has been estimated at the equivalent of tens of billions of modern dollars. The vaults of the Bank of England were being emptied shipment by shipment across submarine-infested waters to pay for the weapons Britain needed to survive. It was not a loan, it was a liquidation. Beyond the gold, Britain was required to sell its American investments. The largest and most consequential of these forced sales was the American Viscose Corporation, one of the most profitable manufacturing businesses in the United States, which had been built up by British investors over decades and represented a genuinely valuable commercial asset. The American government required Britain to sell it. The sale was conducted at speed, under duress, and at a price that reflected the seller's inability to refuse. The proceeds were credited against Britain's account. The asset was gone. This was the pattern. Britain did not choose to liquidate its American holdings. It was required to. The fire sale was a precondition for the assistance that followed. If nobody has explained to you that Lend-Lease, the program presented to the American public as a neighborly favor, was accompanied by a systematic audit and liquidation of every British asset in America, subscribe now. The special relationship was, in its financial architecture, a relationship between a creditor and a client. The terms were set by the creditor. Stay with us. Lend-Lease was introduced to the American public through a metaphor that Roosevelt deployed with characteristic skill. If your neighbor's house is on fire, he said, you do not sell him the hose. You lend it to him. After the fire is out, he returns it or replaces it. It was a reassuring analogy for an electorate that wanted to help Britain but did not want to be drawn into the war. It was also, as a description of what was actually happening, almost entirely misleading. The reality of Lend-Lease, as it was administered by Henry Morgenthau Jr. at the U.S. Treasury, was considerably more forensic than the fire hose analogy suggested. American inspectors and accountants conducted a detailed audit of British assets and finances as a condition of the program. The extent of this audit was remarkable. It covered not just the major financial instruments and overseas investments that one might expect to be examined, but reached down into the operational details of British commerce and industry. Everything was scrutinized. The British government was required to demonstrate, category by category, that it had exhausted every other means of paying before it could receive American assistance on Lend-Lease terms. Morgenthau and his colleagues at the Treasury were not sentimental about the relationship. They were bureaucrats with a mandate, and their mandate was to ensure that American assistance to Britain served American interests. The assistance was genuine. Without it, Britain could not have continued fighting, and the consequences of a British defeat for American security were real. But the conditions attached to that assistance were designed with considerable care to ensure that Britain emerged from the war in a permanently diminished financial position relative to the United States. This was not an accident of the negotiations. It was an objective. The basis for Destroyers' Agreement of September 1940 illustrated the terms of the relationship with particular clarity. Britain, desperate for naval capacity to defend its shipping lanes, offered the United States 99-year leases on strategic military bases across its Caribbean and Atlantic territories in exchange for 50 destroyers. The destroyers were old. They were, by the standards of 1940, obsolete. They had been decommissioned from active service because the United States Navy no longer considered them sufficiently capable for its own purposes. Britain received them anyway because Britain had no alternative, and in exchange, it handed the United States a century of rights to military installations at Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, and other locations that represented the physical infrastructure of its Atlantic strategic position. 50 rusting ships for the strategic footprint of an empire. The most consequential financial clause in the entire Lend-Lease structure was not about gold or ships or bases. It was about trade. Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Agreement committed Britain, as a condition of receiving assistance, to the principle of non-discrimination in international trade after the war. In practice, this meant the dismantling of the imperial preference system, the network of preferential trading arrangements between Britain and its empire and commonwealth that had been the economic foundation of imperial unity since 1932. American exporters wanted access to imperial markets. Article 7 was the mechanism by which they got it. Britain signed its own economic death warrant for the empire as a trading unit in exchange for the weapons it needed to survive. The men who designed this clause understood precisely what they were doing. The imperial preference system was the economic architecture that made the empire function as an integrated commercial unit. Dismantle it, and you did not merely open imperial markets to American competition. You dissolved the economic rationale for the empire itself. The political structures would persist for a time, because political structures have their own momentum, but the financial logic that held them together, the preferential access to markets, the guaranteed trading relationships, the monetary arrangements that made sterling a functional imperial currency, all of this was what Article 7 was targeting. And Britain signed it, because Britain had no choice. The war ended in August 1945, with the Japanese surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 21st, 1945, 7 days after the Japanese announcement, the United States terminated Lend-Lease with immediate effect. Not with a transitional period to allow Britain to adjust, not with a negotiated wind-down that acknowledged the scale of the disruption. Immediately, shipments already at sea were recalled. Contracts were canceled. The program that had been Britain's financial lifeline for 4 years was switched off as abruptly as a light. The effect in Britain was a crisis that the government privately described as a financial Dunkirk. The country had been running its war economy on Lend-Lease for years. Its dollar reserves were exhausted. Its export industries had been converted to war production and could not immediately be reconverted to generate the foreign exchange earnings that peacetime required. The overseas investments that had underpinned the balance of payments before the war were gone, liquidated during the conflict. Britain was, in every measurable financial sense, bankrupt. It had won the war and lost the peace before the peace had properly begun. Britain was a moral giant in 1945 and an economic pygmy. It had sacrificed its financial future to defeat Hitler, and the country that had been its most important ally had structured that sacrifice to ensure that the future belonged to Washington rather than London. If this changes how you understand the special relationship, subscribe and share it. The real history of the alliance is in the contracts, not the speeches. The British government sent John Maynard Keynes to Washington in the autumn of 1945 to negotiate the financial assistance that Britain needed to survive the peace. Keynes was the most important economist alive. He was also gravely ill. He would be dead within 8 months, and he was being asked to perform one of the most difficult diplomatic tasks in British history in circumstances of almost complete weakness. He had hoped to negotiate a gift, a recognition by the Americans of the financial sacrifices Britain had made in a common cause, the cancellation of debts incurred in the service of shared values, the moral acknowledgement that Britain had spent its treasure to protect a civilization from which the United States had also benefited. What Keynes received instead was a commercial loan. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement of December 1945 provided Britain with a credit facility of $3.75 billion at 2% interest, repayable over 50 years. It was not a generous gift between partners. It was a bank lending to a client it assessed as creditworthy enough to repay, but not strong enough to negotiate better terms. The conditions attached to the loan went beyond the financial. Britain was required to restore sterling convertibility within 1 year of the agreement coming into force, making the pound freely exchangeable into dollars. The American negotiators understood, and Keynes feared, that premature convertibility in a country with exhausted reserves would trigger a run on sterling. They required it anyway. The sterling convertibility crisis arrived precisely when Keynes had predicted it would. In the summer of 1947, as required by the loan agreement, Britain made sterling convertible. Within weeks, the dollar reserves that the loan had provided were being drawn down at a catastrophic rate as holders of sterling around the world converted their holdings into dollars as quickly as they could. Convertibility had to be suspended after 6 weeks, in violation of the loan agreement's terms, with the reserves nearly exhausted. The conditions the Americans had insisted upon had produced exactly the crisis that everyone with knowledge of the financial position had warned they would produce. The strings had been designed, whether intentionally or through indifference, to strangle. The final accounting of what the war had cost Britain financially runs to figures that require careful interpretation to be understood in their full significance. The direct financial cost of the conflict, in terms of debt incurred and assets liquidated, was enormous. But the deeper cost was the structural transformation of Britain's position in the global financial system. Before the war, the pound sterling was the world's primary reserve currency. The City of London was the center of global finance. British overseas investments generated income that funded a permanent current account surplus. British banks and insurance companies and trading houses underpinned the movement of goods and capital across the global economy. After the war, all of this had been transferred. The dollar was the world's reserve currency. New York was the center of global finance. American overseas investment was the engine of the global economy. The transfer had not been negotiated. It had been the price of survival. The final payment on the Anglo-American Loan of 1945 was made on December 29th, 2006. 61 years after the agreement was signed, 2 generations of British taxpayers had been servicing a debt incurred in a war that ended before most of them were born. The last check was for $83 million. It settled at last the account that had been opened when Keynes sat down across from the American negotiators in the autumn of 1945 and discovered that the price of survival was a commercial transaction. The United States did not conquer the British Empire. It did not send armies to occupy Whitehall or plant its flag over Buckingham Palace. It did not need to. What it did was more elegant and more final. It waited until the moment of maximum British vulnerability, when survival depended on American assistance and there was no alternative source of help available, and it structured that assistance in ways that transferred the assets, dismantled the trading architecture, and imposed the financial obligations that would ensure the century that followed belonged to Washington rather than London. It was a distressed asset sale, managed by the American Treasury, dressed in the language of alliance and solidarity. The special relationship that Churchill coined as a phrase, and that British governments have invoked ever since as the defining description of the Anglo-American connection, has always contained this founding transaction within it. The relationship is real. The shared values, the shared language, the genuine warmth between the two countries and their people, all of this is real. But it is a relationship between partners who do not begin from the same position, and who have never, since 1945, begun from the same position. Britain emerged from the war as a moral giant and an economic supplicant. The United States emerged from the same war as the wealthiest and most financially powerful country the world had ever seen. Those are not the foundations of an equal partnership. They are the foundations of a particular kind of dependency, one that has been managed with great skill and genuine warmth on both sides, but that has never stopped being what it was at the beginning. Britain was the banker of the 19th century. It was the moral conscience of the Second World War, and it was the client of the peace that followed. The sacrifice was genuine, the accounting was merciless, and the bill, finally settled in 2006, was 60 years of compound interest on the price of survival. History is not over, it is underwritten.